As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Sponsors who are in positions of power have a lot more ability to make some of these more substantial changes. So part of the takeaway is like you have more influence than you might think. But also, if you're in a position of power, you want to be intentional about how you share and use that power. I think there are a lot of people who engage in sponsorship already, but are not very thoughtful about how they're doing it or who they're doing it for. And my hope is with the book, we can illuminate some of those patterns, make it clear how they're problematic, and hope that, helping people to see how they could be more expansive in who they would consider for sponsorship.
That was Rosalind Chow on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
I'm Yael Schoenbrunn, a clinical psychologist, faculty at Brown University, author of Work, Parent Thrive, and a biweekly newsletter on relationships.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey everyone, it's Debbie. I'm bringing you a conversation with Rosalind Chow about her terrific new book, The Doors You Can Open. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And instead of our usual co-host introduction, we are playing around with the idea of doing a post-discussion chat. And so please stick around to the end of the episode and you can hear Yael and me discuss the conversation and add a few of our thoughts. And let us know how you like this format. Do you prefer the co-host intro or would you rather do a post-episode debrief? We want to hear what you think. And here we go with my conversation with Rosalind. Rosalind Chow is an associate professor of organizational behavior and theory at Carnegie Mellon University, where she studies the power of social hierarchy and its impact on diversity and inclusion efforts within organizations. She uses her research expertise to direct executive leadership programs aimed at accelerating participants' careers, with a particular focus on the advancement of women and members of marginalized groups. Her brand new book, The Doors You Can Open, introduces the concept of sponsorship as a way we can use our social connections to change the relationships we have with other people and the relationships that other people have with one another in the service of creating greater communal good. Welcome, Rosalind. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, I feel like the timing of this particular topic could not be better. We're in a world where things are really shifting around how people are talking about these diversity and inclusion efforts. And so it just feels especially poignant right now. And I'm sure you have thoughts about what is happening and how things are shifting that we can talk about as we go. But I just really appreciate that your book is coming out at this particular moment. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about the timing of that.
I have many thoughts and many feelings. Writing this book was always a little bit strange for me because even though I'm a social psychologist by training, I actually lean a little bit more towards the sociology side in the way that I think about some of the phenomena that we study. And for a really long time, I was on team systemic racism and systemic problems require systemic solutions. And so when I was writing this book, I felt very conflicted about it because it's a book that does not focus on systemic changes. It focuses on something that's maybe a little bit in between, where, there's this hope that if we can use our networks, which are both kind of things that we have control over, but also become things that impact other people through things in the environment, through who they're connected to. So it was always a little bit weird for me to say, I truly believe in the issues of structural, all the isms, but I'm still going to write a book that is about not some type changes. But now that those structural solutions seem like they're not part of the repertoire anymore, or at least there are a lot of companies that are backing away from their commitments to those types of solutions, the book actually provides, in a way, a nice guideline for those of us who are like, okay, well, my company is not supporting this anymore. What can I do? So it's good and it's also terrible.
As a reader and someone who cares about diversity and inclusion and is disturbed by what's going on, it's actually a ray of hope because it gives me something to think about that I personally can do. And you write in the book that you are focusing on solutions to social inequality in the workplace. And so solutions is a key part of that. You didn't want to just write about the problems. You wanted to give people something they could do. And you coined this really important idea of sponsorship. And again, to me, I'm like, oh, this is something practical that we can all think about and do. Everyone can be doing this. And so tell us what sponsorship is and how it's different from traditional mentorship that we're all familiar with.
Sure. So the idea here is that, again, sponsorship is different from mentorship. I like to talk about it as mentors act on mentees. There's only two people involved in that relationship, but sponsors don't act on proteges. They act on audiences, so external audiences. There can't be sponsorship without an external audience for the sponsor to act on. But here, the sponsor actually thinks the protege is amazing already. So they're not trying to change anything about the protege. They are trying to change how the audience sees the protege. So I opened the book with a story about Kim Ang and Derek Jeter. So Kim Ang is this Asian American woman. She's the first woman to be a general manager of a Major League Baseball team. She had probably been ready for the job for about 10 to 15 years prior to her actually getting the job. And it had always been this open question of what team is going to be willing to take the step and hire a women general manager. And it wasn't until Derek Jeter, who was someone she had worked with when she was assistant general manager at the Yankees during his time there, it wasn't until he came on, he was a co-owner of the Miami Marlins, and he essentially knew that she was the one he wanted. And he went into that room and probably sponsored the heck out of her. But I use that example because I wanted to be clear, it's not that Derek Jeter was mentoring Kim Ang. It wasn't about making her better than what she was. She was already great. What he needed to do was sell her to other people. And so that's the key difference, is that we, talk about mentors talk to you and sponsors talk about you.
I love that example so much in the book. You revisit it throughout the book a few times. And I think what I love about it is it highlights that systemic issue that women and different marginalized groups often face, which are these kinds of assumptions, and how one person going up to bat for her helped break through that And what he did there was so important. She had all the qualifications. She did a great job. I mean, it got complicated, but
you're right.
I knew nothing about any of this before your book, by the way. I'm not a baseball
Neither
person,
am I.
So. But it's a brilliant example of how he was able to do that. And you're right. He didn't mentor her. That was not his role with her.
No mentorship needed. And that's actually, I think, a big difference in how I think about sponsorship from other people who have talked about sponsorship in the past. I think a lot of people either see mentorship and sponsorship as being the same, or as sponsorship as being like mentorship plus. And I see them as being categorically different types of support that we can give each other anywhere, actually, not just at work.
I want to go on a little slight tangent about mentorship because I want you to help me understand something about that. There is something I've seen cases before, usually with women who are actually pretty well established in their career, but who either seek mentorship, not always, but often from an older sort of powerful male figure, or they are offered mentorship, again, often from an older powerful male figure. And there's something about it that bugged me. And I really had a hard time pinpointing what it was. Can you explain to me why? What was it about that bothered me, do you think? What's your hunch?
Oh, I was about to say, like, tell me more.
I can tell you more if you want, but I'm curious. Yeah, I want to know your thoughts. I have a hunch, but I want to know your thoughts.
This thing is, if you look at the research on gender and mentorship, typically mentorship relationships are same gender. So the preponderance of men are mentored by men and the preponderance of women are mentored by women. Where things get tricky is that because women are often in lower power positions within organizations, a tendency to constantly be mentored by someone who's the same gender means that on average, men tend to have more powerful mentors than do women. And if we assume that a lot of mentorship relationships end up converting into sponsorship relationships, then it does tend to mean that men have more powerful sponsors than women do. And that clearly has an impact on their career progression. The thing is, when men choose to mentor women, they can be incredibly effective. I've seen some statistics that suggest like that particular pairing actually potentially does even better than like when men mentor and like sponsor other men. That's usually because for a man to be willing to mentor and sponsor a woman, the woman has to be truly exceptional. And so then they end up going really far. But I am really curious why you have such an emotional response to that.
I think you're tapping into something about it, but I think that what it is what you were saying earlier about mentorship is about changing the mentee. And I think sometimes the mentor, because they're very powerful, there's almost this vibe that the mentee should try to be like the mentor.
Okay.
And that they should emulate that person. And to me, it feels there's a little bit of a putting that person on a pedestal, and it's related to a power imbalance. And I think it's something about that piece of things, because I'm talking about people who are pretty well established, who are great. And that's why I actually think in the example I'm giving, what they actually really want is a sponsor. Mm-hmm. They don't necessarily need to be told how to be better.
That's
or
right.
Something like that. They are looking for an opportunity, but they have to go through this whole process of like, oh, you're so great. Tell me your ways. Do you know what I'm saying?
No, I mean, so, and this gets to another point in the book that I think is really important, which is that, sponsors are the ones who decide who they want to sponsor. And I feel like so many of us are like, how do I find a sponsor? So how do I build these relationships so that this person's going to be willing to sponsor me? And unfortunately, maybe to get on the radar of a male sponsor is going to require, women to engage in ingratiation in some like particular way, possibly. But I can see how that would be concerning for you. I actually thought you were going to go a slightly different way, which is this other aspect of like, if it takes a powerful sponsor to really lift you up, then isn't it more rational for everyone to like focus on male sponsors to the extent that in general, men tend to be in more powerful positions than women. And that's a conclusion that is also super icky to me. I would really not want to be telling women like, well, if you really want to get ahead, forget women's sponsors, go after men's sponsors. Like that is definitely not one of the takeaways I would want anyone to have.
No, I think this is a really important point, and I really love how you explain this in such a nuanced way in the book about how we can all be sponsors. And so, you might have a smaller amount of social status and still be helpful to someone. And that's great. Like everybody can, but that the people who can really, really help people are these higher status people or these people with a lot of power. And so I actually hope that this conversation and your book reach people who have that kind of power because they are going to have the biggest impact.
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the things that I really hope people take away from the book is that anyone can be a sponsor. You don't have to wait until you're in a position of power to sponsor other people. But you're absolutely right that sponsors who are in positions of power have a lot more ability to make some of these more substantial changes that would be meaningful and have, kind of bigger impacts in our social spheres than you or me. But yes, yeah. I'm hoping that one, people recognize the influence that they have. So part of the takeaway is like you have more influence than you might think. But also if you're in a position of power, you want to be intentional about how you share and use that power. And that's also another thing that I think is worth pointing out, which is that I think there are a lot of people who engage in sponsorship already, but are not very thoughtful about how they're doing it or who they're doing it for, probably more importantly, the latter part. And that's actually one of the contributors of social inequality, is basically like the patterns of sponsorship that exist now. And my hope is with the book, we can illuminate some of those patterns, make it clear how they're problematic, and hope that, helping people to see how they could be more expansive in who they would consider for sponsorship.
Yeah. Yeah. Thinking that through and putting some intentional thought behind it, I think it could change so many things about the world and the workplace. One of the ways that you describe this is being aware, kind of like a broker of knowledge and who has expertise and who needs help, who knows what and who needs what, and whose problem can I help solve? And so can you explain that a little bit? Because I love this idea.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is my personal beef with networking.
Yes, thank you. Networking. It's another thing that gives me a cringy feeling.
That's right. That's right. And, the reason I rail against networking is because I see networking as basically an activity involving power moves. Networking is a great activity if you have resources that other people want, whether that be because of who you know, where you went to school, like what company you work for, we're constantly evaluating each other on our achievements because we're trying to figure out, is this person valuable? Which is just kind of gross to me. And this follows from, more traditional perspectives on networking, where it's really about identifying the resources that you need. Those resources are in people. Those people can give you access to those resources that you need. So in an ideal world, you find the resources that you need through these people and you cultivate relationships with them and fantastic. Great. You do better. But again, that's really treating it's like a commodification of people, which I take issue with. And so the perspective that I put forth in the book is one that really looks at the collective as the ultimate beneficiary of networking. And so what I'm drawing on is this literature base that was done by a lot of my colleagues here, actually, at Carnegie Mellon, on transactive memory systems and collective intelligence. Basically, the idea that the most effective groups are the ones where people know who's good at what. And whenever a problem arises, everybody knows who should be directed to take on that task because they're the ones who are best suited for it. And so it's about this effective coordination of problem identification and solution identification and just making sure that they're matched appropriately. And that's actually another way of thinking about how you can approach networking, is not that you're the beneficiary, right? That you're the recipient of all the resources, but that someone has to be the conduit through which all that knowledge flows. And that's actually another way of providing value to the collective. And it also just so happens that people who do that kind of work for the group get rewarded with status for doing it. And so that's actually one of the reasons why I say in the book that if you want to find a sponsor, you should be a sponsor first, because we sponsor people we like, we sponsor people we trust. And the way to become trustworthy is actually to demonstrate that you care about others and that you care about the group. And what better way to provide value and care about the group than by helping it solve its problems by connecting people who should know each other?
Mm-hmm. It helps build that social capital that you write about, and it helps. It has, to me, a feeling of what goes around comes around a little bit. You're kind of spreading that in the world, and it's not quite so simple, but it often over time will come back to you. Can you say more about the very important relationship between sponsorship and trust? Because that seems to be a really key and somewhat complicated element of sponsorship.
Yeah, so it's another way that differentiates sponsorship from mentorship. So, when you think about mentorship relationships, for those to work, your mentee has to trust the mentor. Because otherwise, if the mentee doesn't trust the mentor, then what's the point? They're not going to follow their advice. Right. They're not going to, they're not coachable. And, from the mentor's perspective, if a mentee doesn't trust them, or if they don't trust the mentee, it kind of doesn't really matter. It matters in the sense that, well, that's like a waste of time, But what's different about sponsorship relationships is that for sponsors to be willing to sponsor, they have to trust the protege. In a way, it's less important that the protege trusts the sponsor. And in some cases, because proteges don't even know that they have sponsors, there's no trust in the sponsor at all, because as far as the protege is concerned, there is no relationship there. So I've definitely heard stories of people who didn't realize until way, way, way after the fact that they had some sort of fairy godparent figure who, higher up in the organization, who had just kind of taken an interest in them and had been advocating for them in meetings, but they had no idea that this person even knew they existed. So this is to say, yes, proteges, sometimes need to trust sponsors, but really what sponsors are doing is they're putting a lot of trust in the protege. And then also the audience is putting a lot of trust in the sponsor. Because if audiences don't trust the sponsor, then they're not going to listen to what the sponsor has to say about their proteges. And then, then I guess I could sponsor all I want, but nothing's going to happen.
Nobody's going to listen.
Right. So, you're absolutely right. Trust is a really important part of sponsorship, but it's different in the sense of who needs to trust whom is really different. And that's also why sponsorship is, I think, something that we don't often default to when we want to help other people, because it's riskier for us as sponsors. When we tell other people they should trust our judgment, if that judgment turns out to be inaccurate or it's somehow just misplaced, that's not just the protege kind of burning out with the audience. It's that you're hurting your own relationships with other people. And I think people intuitively understand that, and which is why they're more hesitant to be sponsors than they are to be mentors.
Yeah, I remember having conversations about that when I had more of a training and teaching role, and it would, people would want letters of recommendation, and you don't want to recommend people that aren't good or give them, praise them too much, because you want people to trust you and your word. And if you aren't conscious of that, you can lose some of that trust.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I want to talk more about sponsorship gone wrong.
Okay.
Which is, I think sponsorship can go wrong when it's biased. And you have a section in the book about how we decide who deserves sponsorship and how we evaluate sponsorship. And so how can we make decisions about that are fair and that aren't going to just make the inequity problem worse?
I know. Yeah. So there's a version where you say, actually, sponsorship is the problem. And so therefore we should just get rid of it. And I could even get behind that idea if I believed that all other forms of evaluation were not biased in some way. But sponsorship sometimes is the antidote to bias, especially when sponsors are seeing something in someone that others can't see because of bias. And so then they can actually argue in favor of and provide evidence of how great their proteges are, in contrast to all the other criticism that's coming out. So it is a double-edged sword in the sense that, to the extent that we tend to like the people we like, who tend to be people who are like us, and we are therefore more likely to trust them and therefore more likely to sponsor them, it does lead to a cycle where potentially, the people who get sponsorship are people who probably would have been successful anyway. But again, sponsorship is just a way to perhaps push back on that if more of us are more intentional about what we keep our eyes out for and actually speak up for these people.
Yeah. Yeah, instead of just giving the benefit of the doubt maybe to people who would have already had the benefit of the doubt. It's like you're kind of looking out for maybe some of those people who could be overlooked and then bringing them more visibility, amplifying their voice, that type of thing. Yeah. Again, thoughtful and intentional about it. You could see you could just imagine a world in which that is happening, where it has that kind of bias that is actually not really helpful, particularly.
I do go back and forth on that. And the thing that I come back to is this idea of, for example, resume blinding. I know a lot of companies are really excited about resume blinding because recruiters have bias. I mean, just doing these audit studies, even with the names, you see these differences in who gets called back. And so the idea being, if you can scrub resumes of any sort of demographic information that would lead people to, activate those biases, that might actually make recruitment more fair. But when you look at actual field studies where they've implemented resume blinding, what they actually find is that for a lot of these companies, the diversity and representation actually goes down. And it is because people were actually able to use the demographic information and adjust for the bias that they assumed, right, that those applicants were facing. And so they would elevate those applicants because they would assume oh, well, it'd be the equivalent of oh, you scored I guess these days the SAT scoring system is different. Back in my age, right? It would feel like you scored a 1300, but actually for a person coming out of your background to score a 1300 is actually super meaningful, because you were facing all this adversity. But imagine now you have a situation going back to college admissions, the only thing you have to go on is the SAT score. Well, now you no longer have the ability to make that adjustment after the fact, right? So I feel that way about sponsorship too. If we moved in a direction where, like, let's just say no sponsorship, right? Because it's hugely biased. Well, then you actually have one less tool in your arsenal to try and equalize things.
That's true. Because again, it just goes back to this idea of social capital and how you really can use that for the greater good. And you can use, like, if you happen to have power and or social capital or status, that you can use it in these ways. Maybe if you catch something that somebody else isn't catching,
right?
Like a person who's being overlooked or someone who's really quiet, but they have good ideas and they're passionate and so on and so forth. It reminds me of helping people find a voice at the table.
Yeah.
If they're not naturally given a bullhorn. You know?
Actually, this reminds me of a story that I hate to admit that I can't remember if I included it in the book or not. But there
writing is like that. You kind of, what did I write? I can't remember.
Too many edits. What got chopped? So this is a story of a woman who she was a Black woman, professional, high up in the organization, and she had a mentor who let her know that in her last performance review meeting, that there had been a discussion about how they didn't think she was ready for, a higher leadership position because she just didn't seem strategic enough, that she seemed like she was really in the weeds, constantly focused on little details. And so he was the one who was assigned to come back and share that feedback with her. If they had had a standard mentorship relationship, maybe she would have been like, okay, I'll work on that. And if he really wanted to help her, he'd be like, okay, I'll watch you the next couple of meetings. I'll talk to you about how you can pitch things in a way that make you look more strategic. But actually, they had the kind of relationship where she came back to him and she said, look, with respect, sir, but I have to be detail oriented. I have to know everything inside and out, because if I don't know the answer, people don't infer from my inability to have an answer to some really nitty detail like thing that it's because I'm too busy focusing on the bigger picture and that I'm being strategic. They are going to interpret that as me not knowing and me being incompetent. And so sorry, but I'm going to be like just as detail oriented as I have been before because I don't have that leeway. And the story could have ended there. But actually, what was really great is that this guy then went back to his partners and he said, you know what? This is like her experience. And why are we asking for our leaders to seem strategic and big picture focused in terms of how they present themselves? Like, if I have all this other evidence that she actually is capable of thinking big picture and great ideas for strategy, why does it matter if that comes out in meetings, especially internal meetings? Like, this should not be a part of our evaluation criteria. Like, why are we even talking about this? And he was actually able to convince all of the partners that, like, oh, yeah, this is not the only way to demonstrate the skill. So this should be like, from now on, we're not going to talk about this anymore. And so they changed the process because of her feedback. But again, it was because he was willing to go to his partners and be like, hey guys, like, this is maybe not the right way we should be doing things. Maybe we should consider a different way. And he had enough social capital among his partners that they actually agreed with him. Because you could also imagine him doing that and then being like, you're crazy. And then that would both not be great for him and not be great for her. So thankfully it all worked out. But this is all to say, like, he was sponsoring her, but he also sponsored her in a way that changed process, which I think is like kind of the best of all worlds with sponsorship in trying to make organizations more equitable. is having sponsors not just stand up for individuals, but also making changes to the process that make it more equitable for everyone.
I love that. That's such a great example. And I think that that's another thing people who have power and social capital can do, which is look at the systems. Like you were talking about the systems earlier, like how do we evaluate people? What's our promotion system? What's our hiring system? And to look for those. And I love actually the story of how you ended up creating the Advanced Leadership Institute and the Executive Leadership Academy. And it feels like it's been tied to your research, but it's also had this huge, really practical application. So could you tell the story of that work that you've been doing and how you got there? Because you're actually a perfect example of this kind of idea in action in a number of ways.
Yes, I would agree with that. So the Advanced Leadership Initiative, which is now an institute, originally approached Carrie Mellon about pulling together an executive leadership program for them. It was going to be their flagship program. It's a group that is actually focused on developing and retaining Black professional talent in Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh actually has a really difficult time retaining Black talent. People come here, they work up to like middle manager jobs, and then they usually end up leaving for cities that have more well-established middle class Black communities. And so they were trying to bulk out the community here, and had gotten support from some of the larger corporations in the area to start putting together this program and building out this community of Black leaders. So they came to Carrie Mellon, and I get an email from one of the people working in executive education. Her name is Leanne Myers. Thank you, Leanne. And she asked me if I would be willing to serve as faculty director for this new program for Black professionals in Pittsburgh. You could probably gather from my last name, which is Chow. I am not Black. I am actually a really small Asian woman. And so I was just like, I don't get it. But turns out there were a lot of good reasons for why I was a good fit. I study, as you mentioned, power and social hierarchy. I have typically studied it through the lens of racial inequalities. But I was also doing research on sponsorship, and they wanted their program to have a sponsorship component, which is actually the original reason why Leanne thought of me. Anyway, Evan Fraser, who was the director of the Advanced Leadership Institute, was really gracious from the very beginning. His partner, Greg Spencer, was a little bit more skeptical, but I was really passionate about it. And the program ended up being really fantastic. Definitely a highlight of my career. I think we put together a really wonderful program. It has, I think, led to some truly amazing relationships between participants, but also between participants and their sponsors. And there's been a lot of advancement among the people who have gone through the program. And what I think is funny is that after that first day, the first day that I taught in the program, Greg became a convert. And I think what you're alluding to is that I think there were many people in the room who were extremely skeptical about my suitability as an Asian woman to lead a program for Black professionals. Because, let's just be honest, I will never have the lived experience of a Black person, but I am very qualified in other ways that are also very important. And so I'm glad to say that I converted my skeptic. He was a good friend and sponsor and mentor of mine now.
He not only came around, but has sponsored you.
Yeah.
And the program itself was a success, putting your ideas into action, and it lines up with your research. And it just feels like it was kind of I think at one point in the book, you say it's like a win-win-win-win.
Yeah, no, that's right.
A win on all directions.
Yeah, but it was really scary. It was really scary. I went back and forth on whether or not I wanted to do it. I asked Evan a number of times if he wanted to bring in somebody else to lead it. I think I tried to talk myself out of doing it a lot.
a big leap of courage to do it. Yeah. Outside your comfort zone.
Definitely.
Your work led also to a Harvard Business Review article and interview. Can you tell us about that? Because that's another example in your career.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, I do research on sponsorship. And one of the first papers that I was working on got accepted into this very small conference that was being held at Harvard Business School. I gave a really great talk, if I could just say so myself.
Do it.
People were really into it. I mean, so the research is actually really cool. I love the research, and I wanted to use that opportunity actually to really sell the audience on Elizabeth Campbell, who is the doctoral student who was working with me on that research. So at the end of the talk, I was basically like, if you like what you heard here, you're going to love Elizabeth. And she's going to be on the job market soon. And, you know, anyone, like, if you're really into this, you should definitely check her out. So it was my way of sponsoring Elizabeth to potential people who could potentially hire her. And as it turns out, there was a host of Women at Work in the audience. They had been looking for someone who could talk about sponsorship, you know, kind of in a theoretical academic sense. But they had also been looking for someone who would like walk the walk. And so when I sponsored Elizabeth, at least this is what the producer told me when she reached out to me later, she said, you know, and actually the reason why you really like got on our radar is because you sponsored Elizabeth, and it's so clear that you want to do the things that you are studying. So then I had, you know, this episode on Women at Work. It introduced me to some of the editors at HBR. Amy Gallo is also a huge sponsor of mine. Thank you, Amy. And she was actually interviewing me for a book that she was writing. And I mentioned to her that I was thinking about writing a book. I hadn't actually ever told anybody at that point that I had been thinking about writing a book. She was the first person I had actually articulated that thought to, you know, so I told her about sponsorship and what I wanted to say about it. And she said, you should absolutely write that book. And oh, by the way, can you please write me a little something? And I'm going to pitch it to the other editors at HBR. And so that was how I got my first HBR article. And the positive reception of that article also gave me more confidence in the fact that, you know, this book is needed out there in the world. So definitely needed that confidence boost because the book took me 4 years to write. So, needed to hold on to that.
Well, you've been a little busy, so and it's a long process. But actually, I told you offline before we started the interview that I didn't put two and two together until I was a ways into your book. Oh, I read that. Somebody shared that article with me back then. It made a big splash and was impactful. And it's pretty cool. I mean, this isn't a great illustration of what goes around comes around, that by you yourself speaking up about sponsorship and doing it in your talk, live in your talk, it led you to these opportunities, and, you know, it's kind of taken off from there.
I know. So it's actually, it's crazy when you're someone who studies sponsorship, because now I also like am constantly wondering, okay, should I sponsor this person? How many opportunities do I have to like sponsor people? Be careful what you study, I guess, is what I would say.
Well, that's a good thing. It's always on your radar to be sponsoring and looking for potential opportunities to do that and be that kind of knowledge broker you're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I am going to just put in one last plug for your book, because you dive into so many interesting topics and examples. It's very evidence-based. You have a lot of research in there. It's very inspiring in a moment when we need inspiration and practical things that we can do. And so really appreciate your work, and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on and talking to me about it and bringing back some strange memories that I haven't thought about in a while.
My pleasure. That's what I'm here for. So again, the book is called The Doors You Can Open. And Rosalind, where can people find you online? Do you have a website or social media or anything like that?
I do have a website. It's just www.rosalindchow.com. I actually encourage people to follow me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. I write a lot about research on LinkedIn, but more importantly, I don't write about my own research. So it is not about sharing what I'm working on. It's actually really about amplifying the research that other people are doing that I think is really important and that I would like others in the world to know about at a faster speed than is usually common in academia. So if you're really into social science research, follow me. I summarize awesome findings being done by great researchers. And then I also tell you what you should do with those findings.
That's fantastic. I actually just found you recently on LinkedIn and am so excited to see what you share there. Thank you, Rosalind, so much. I really enjoyed chatting with you today.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for sticking around to the end of the episode, everyone. I am here with Yael for a little post-episode chat to kind of talk about some of the things in the episode. First of all, I just loved Rosalind. I'm like, she's just an awesome person. I really enjoyed chatting with her. Yael, I know you've met her too.
Yeah, she exudes kindness. She's the kind of person that you want to be connected to in whatever kind of role.
And she really, walks the talk. Because even that she uses her LinkedIn to like amplify other people's voices. And you can see so many examples of her doing sponsorship. So tell me a few of your thoughts, Yael, about the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'll also just mention just about Rosalind, who I don't know very well, but I met through an academic writers group. And she already has floated my name for speaker roles in other places because that really is one of, I'm sure, many examples of her walking the talk and really trying to support other women in their professional trajectories. But I really loved this episode. And I hadn't, even though I have a PhD, which is done under a mentorship model, I hadn't thought so much about the difference between sponsorship and mentorship, but it really is such an important distinction. And I was thinking about this in the context of my efforts to try to get out there a little bit more on social media, specifically on LinkedIn and Instagram, which is really hard for me. And I've been really fortunate to get some mentorship about how to do it, which I still don't do very perfectly, as well as some sponsorship from people who have bigger platforms who are willing to kind of shout out my name. And then I've had the less fortunate examples where I've tried to get mentorship and it hasn't gone so well, or sponsorship from somebody who doesn't have as much platform. And so them sharing my name doesn't help as much. So it's interesting. You really do have to find the right match. And when the match is off in terms of what it is that you're needing, what kind of support you're needing in your professional efforts, it really can feel ineffective.
Yeah. And I think it's just so important to have the distinction, to understand the difference between the two and what is it that you're looking for. And in some ways, it's just easier to ask for mentorship. When really, I think we talked about this in the conversation, what you actually need is somebody to kind of help you, like boost you along. Because some people, it's just, you need to get yourself out there in whatever way, or you need the opportunity and you have the skills already. But I think that because sponsorship has to sometimes be initiated by the person doing the sponsoring, it's a little bit harder to ask for that, or you're worried they're going to say no or something. So it's just an important thing to be clear on. What is it that I need here? Because sometimes we actually have the skills and we're doing important things and we are good at it. So we don't really need mentorship. Sometimes we do.
Yeah. And one of the really uncomfortable things that comes to mind in terms of asking for sponsorship that's not as true of asking for mentorship is that you're basically asking for somebody who might be further ahead in their career to put their name on the line. And if they don't know you super well, if you don't yet have good confidence that they'll think highly of you, it can feel like a tall order. But, the thing that comes to my mind is the episode that I did with Zoe Chance, where she talks about the science behind doing the ask, because you might get a no, but you might actually be able to convince and demonstrate to somebody who potentially could be a sponsor of your skill set, of the value in that you bring to the table, and then it's a boon to them. And that makes me think of Jill's recent episode with Allison Frigale, who talks about helping to promote other people is a way that you help yourself as well as the other person. It's really a give-give kind of relationship, which makes me think of this line of research that I've written about before that looks at this difference between transactional relationships versus communal relationships. And Rosalind talked about this concern that she has about sort of commodifying our relationships to try to see them as like serving either the sponsorship or this mentorship role. And that we don't want to lose sight of like relationships being for the sake of relationships, for the sake of connection. And I think that we really can do both. Like rather than getting all the way transactional, we can sort of foster these relationships and see them as like give, but also recognize that we're also getting something out of them that's really special.
And I do think that when I think of relationships that I've had that have a little bit more of a transactional feel to them, I want something from you, you want, it just makes me not want to talk to that person. You feel like they're trying to get something from you. You feel like they don't really care about you necessarily. And so I think it can be damaging.
Right. And maybe some guidelines around this would be helpful because I do think that you can ask for something without it coming across as transactional. If you signal to the other person that you like them and appreciate them, and it's okay if they say no, and you'll still have a relationship, that your relationship isn't contingent on them serving a particular function for you. And so I think that can really set apart the communal versus the transactional relationship.
Yeah, that's right. It's all about kind of putting it in that context. And there was something from this episode that I just realized I've really been putting into action, which is that two of my friends who don't know each other have kids that are going to start at the same school next year. And I was like, oh my gosh, they will love each other and their kids can meet and have a friend at their new school built in. And I set up a coffee date with them. And I was just thinking about Rosalind with that, how like when you can do something like this for people, there's no real benefit to me, but I was like, oh, that it feels really good to do that. And I think this book had made me realize that there are opportunities to connect people in all kinds of ways and just paying more attention to that.
Yeah. I think having the relationships is so beautiful, and helping people develop relationships is really something that feels so good. I will say, just as a podcaster who's been able to connect with other podcasters, I have the potential to connect people who are trying to get their books out to new audiences. And it's like this weirdly gratifying thing where I feel so good about myself when I connect authors to other podcasts that they can showcase their work. So seeking out sponsorship and mentorship is so important, but offering it and connecting other people to those kinds of relationships is so beautiful too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. We will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.